which were again scarce and nowhere near enough to solve the problem across the entire front. They needed a solution now, and what Germany had right now, what it could produce immediately, were obsolete tank chassis, powerful anti-tank guns, and an already tried-out idea that seemed like it could work. When the Germans occupied Soviet territories, they captured around 1,300 Soviet 76mm field guns. These could be rechambered to fire the German Pak-40 cartridge, which had much higher velocity and was a genuine anti-tank round. They managed to do this, and the result was a gun that could destroy any tank in the world at standard combat range. That's one ingredient. The second ingredient was whatever chassis happened to be available. Captured French Lorraine tracked artillery tractors came in handy. The Germans had about 300 of those. Among many other vehicles, they were combining with either their own anti-tank guns or these converted captured guns, creating several sub-variants of the same basic concept. About 170 Lorraine tractors were converted with the 7.5cm Pak-40 mounted in a lightly armored, open-topped superstructure with a maximum of 12mm of armor. That was the Marder 1. The Marder 2 used the Panzer II chassis, another German light tank that had become obsolete as a combat vehicle. The Marder 3, built on the reliable Czechoslovak Panzer 38-ton chassis, was the most numerous version, and it was built in several variations depending on which gun was used and how it was mounted. The guns worked brilliantly, and they were a huge improvement over the previous door-knocking 37mm. They could now reliably kill any tank they encountered at significant range. But every Marder variant shared the same fundamental problem. The crew was exposed. The fighting compartment was open-topped, with thin armor on the front and sides, 10 to 15mm at most, enough to stop small arms fire and maybe shrapnel fragments, but nothing more. The crew stood in this open box on a chassis that was too tall, sitting out on the open steppe of the Eastern Front, visible from far away to enemy gunners. Any near miss from an artillery shell or mortar round showered the compartment with shrapnel. Soviet anti-tank rifles went through the armor like tissue paper. And don't even think about urban fighting, where someone could drop literally anything on your head from above, like here in Saving Private Ryan. So, while the Marder versions were yet another stopgap, the Germans now knew they needed something reliable and sustainable, because Allied tanks weren't going anywhere. They were just getting thicker in armor and arriving in bigger numbers, and the Germans already had another vehicle in service that was about to prove itself far more suitable for the tank-killing role, the Stug 3 assault gun. The same logic that transformed the Panzer IV applied to the Stug 3, but with a twist that made it even more significant. The Germans developed the 7.5cm Stuck 40, essentially the same weapon as the Panzer IV's new gun, adapted for casemate mounting with slightly modified cartridges for easier handling in the cramped interior. And just like that, the Stug 3 wasn't an infantry support weapon anymore, but a tank killer. And it brought real advantages. A silhouette of just 2.16 meters, which is about 7 feet. Thicker frontal armor for the same weight, because the armor only had to cover a fixed face rather than a rotating structure. The results were immediate. They began destroying hundreds of Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front, where the terrain was perfect for them, especially for ambushes. The Stug 3 would go on to become the most produced German tracked armored vehicle of the entire war, over 10,000 units built. And by German claims, it destroyed more enemy tanks than Panthers and Tigers combined. They finally had the right sustainable solution, instead of Frankenstein merging whatever guns and chassis they had lying around. But that doesn't mean they were going to stop doing it, not even close. Because what you've seen so far was just the warm-up. The Germans had stumbled into a realization that would shape the rest of the war. Mounting a powerful anti-tank gun on an existing tank chassis without a turret produced a vehicle that was cheaper, lower, and simpler than a tank. And in defensive combat, which is what their war was rapidly turning into on every front, it could be much deadlier. Germany would now pursue this concept across every available chassis and weight class, and the vehicles that followed fall into a clear pattern. Each one was either a reaction to a specific battlefield problem, an attempt to mount an even bigger gun on something that could carry it, or an emergency response to a production crisis, and sometimes all three at once. Now, the 75mm Pak-40 and its vehicle-mounted cousins were good. They could handle the T-34 reliably, and they could deal with the KV-1 at moderate range. But there was a problem with thinking that 75mm was going to be enough going forward. What the Germans could not guarantee was that these guns would kill whatever the Soviets fielded next. German intelligence was already picking up reports of heavier Soviet tanks in development. And there was another problem that no amount of 75mm upgrades could solve, and that was range. On the vast open steppe of the Eastern Front, engagements could begin at 2, sometimes 3 kilometers. And at those distances, the side that could kill at longer range had an enormous advantage. The 75mm L-48 was effective out to perhaps 1,500 meters against a T-34. Beyond that, accuracy and penetration fell off sharply. Germany needed something that could reach out further and hit harder. And the weapon that could do this already existed. It was the 8.8 centimeter flak gun, the famous 88, the same gun that had been killing tanks since the Spanish Civil War and had proven itself the most feared anti-armor weapon in every theater where it appeared. The Germans already knew what this caliber could do. The question was how to get it onto a mobile platform in a form that was actually designed for anti-tank work from the ground up. The weapon they developed was the 8.8 centimeter PaK-43 L71. A dedicated anti-tank gun derived from the Flak 41, but with a longer barrel and higher muzzle velocity. With a muzzle velocity of over 1,000 meters per second, firing armor-piercing rounds. It could penetrate 190 millimeters of rolled steel at 1,000 meters, using tungsten-cored ammunition. It could kill any tank in the world, from any angle, at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Nothing was safe from this gun. The towed version entered service in 1943, but it had a serious practical problem. It weighed over 4 tons. It required a large crew. The troops nicknamed it the barn door because of its massive gun shield. Getting it into a firing position quickly under combat conditions was just impossible. You can have the best anti-tank gun in the world, but if you can't move it to where it needs to be and get it set up before the enemy is on top of you, it doesn't matter. So the obvious solution was to put the PaK-43 on a self-propelled chassis. And that is exactly what happened, but not in one clean, rational way. It happened in multiple different ways. On multiple different chassis, driven by different requirements, different political pressures, and different levels of desperation. The result was an entire family of 88mm armed tank destroyers that ranged from brilliant improvisations to engineering masterpieces to catastrophic failures. And sometimes, honestly, all three at once in the same vehicle. But before we get to any of those vehicles, there's something you need to understand about the gun itself, because it causes confusion to this day. And if you don't get this straight now, nothing that comes next will make full sense. When people hear German 88, they usually think of one weapon, one gun. In reality, there were two completely different 88mm guns, and the difference between them was enormous. They shared the same caliber, the same 88mm bore diameter, but that's where the similarity ended. They used different ammunition. They had different barrels, and one was far more powerful than the other. A Tiger I crew could not use the ammunition from a Nashorn or a Jagdpanther and vice versa. So here's how this actually breaks down, and it's simpler than it sounds, believe me. The first 88 was the famous Flak 18, the anti-aircraft gun that had been around since the early 1930s. When it came time to arm the Tiger I heavy tank, the Germans adapted this anti-aircraft gun to fit inside a turret. The result was the 8.8 centimeter KWK-36, and the key detail is the cartridge it fired. The brass case that held the propellant powder was 571 millimeters long. So, this is the 88 by 571 cartridge. That's the Tiger I's gun. That's the Flak 18 lineage. And now, here are the tank destroyers that were armed with the PaK-43. Each one a different answer to the same question, which was how do you make this thing mobile and get it to the front? And then there's one vehicle you're going to hear about that carried something even more extreme. Something that made even the PaK-43 look moderate. The first attempt to make the PaK-43 mobile was the Nashorn, and it came together with the kind of speed that only wartime urgency produces. A properly armored tank destroyer on a heavy chassis was still far away from production. They needed something now, built from whatever was available, and by now you can probably predict the formula. The solution was to take the recently developed Geschützwagen 3/4 chassis, which was a hybrid platform that combined components from both the Panzer III and the Panzer IV, and mount the PaK-43 on top in an open-topped fighting compartment. The vehicle was initially called the Hornisse, meaning hornet. Hitler later renamed it Nashorn, meaning rhinoceros, because apparently he got to name things. What rolled off the line was, by any honest assessment, a compromise. The gun was magnificent. It could destroy any Allied tank at ranges well beyond what the enemy could effectively